The string quartet in the corner of the grand ballroom played a soft, unobtrusive melody, a gentle current beneath the sea of conversation. It was the kind of party that made it into the society pages, not for any single dramatic event, but for the sheer weight of its collective importance. The air itself seemed to shimmer, thick with the scent of expensive perfume, freshly cut lilies, and the faint, crisp aroma of champagne. Light from a massive crystal chandelier spilled down onto polished marble floors, reflecting off the jewels that dripped from necks and wrists, and from the delicate stems of the countless glasses being held by elegantly manicured hands. This was the annual gala for the Hawthorne Foundation, and the house was as much a host as the man himself. It was less a home and more a carefully curated museum, a sprawling testament to taste and immense wealth. Walls were hung with paintings that could fund a small country, and sculptures stood in quiet corners like silent, thoughtful guests. Every detail, from the soft, cream-colored linens on the tables to the specific shade of blue in the uplighting, had been chosen with meticulous care. Moving through this sea of opulence was the man who had created it all. He was a billionaire, a name known in boardrooms and on financial news channels across the globe. But here he was simply the host. He had a way of making each person he spoke to feel like they were the only one in the room. His smile was easy, his laugh warm and genuine. He would clasp a shoulder, listen intently to a story about a failing investment, and offer a word of encouragement that felt less like a platitude and more like a genuine piece of wisdom. He wore his power comfortably, like a well-tailored suit, which in this case it was dark, perfectly cut, and devoid of any flashy branding. It was a quiet statement, much like the man himself. Yet, even as he charmed a senator's wife or debated market trends with a rival CEO, his eyes would occasionally drift away from his immediate conversation. They would scan the faces in the crowd, a quick, almost imperceptible sweep, searching for something. For someone, a flicker of something impatience, perhaps, or just longing would cross his features before being smoothed away by his practiced host's smile. He was playing his part, but his heart wasn't in the performance. It was somewhere else in the vast, echoing rooms of his home. Meanwhile, far from the center of the room where the most powerful people congregated, a different scene was unfolding. Near a set of tall glass doors that opened onto a moonlit terrace, a young woman knelt on the floor. She was the host's wife, though you wouldn't know it by looking at her. She wasn't wearing a dress that screamed for attention, no bold colors or daring cuts. Her gown was a simple, elegant sheath of a deep, quiet green, the color of a forest pool at dusk. It moved around her like water as she moved. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was pulled back in a loose, soft knot at the nape of her neck, with a few stray strands escaping to frame a face that was more interesting than it was classically beautiful. Her only jewelry was a delicate silver chain around her ankle, a gift from her husband, almost always hidden by her dress. She was kneeling because a young waiter, looking flustered and overwhelmed by the sheer number of important people in the room, had stumbled. The tray of champagne flutes he was carrying had tilted, and he had only just managed to save it from a catastrophic crash. But in doing so, a few drops of the golden liquid had splashed onto the marble floor, creating a small, slippery puddle. The waiter had frozen, his face pale with terror. Knowing that a slip could ruin an evening and a dress, worth more than his monthly salary, without a moment's hesitation, the woman had quietly made her way over. "It's all right," she had said softly, her voice a calm counterpoint to the room's nervous energy. "These things happen." Now she was using a linen napkin she'd picked up from a nearby table to carefully dab the spill, her movements sure and unhurried. She wasn't thinking about how it might look, the wife of the billionaire cleaning the floor. She was thinking only of the young man whose night was about to be ruined, and of the guests who might not see the small, wet hazard on the gleaming floor. "There now," she said, looking up at him with a kind smile. "All sorted. Just take a deep breath. You're doing a wonderful job." The waiter stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He had no idea who she was, only that she was the kindest, most grounded person he had spoken to all night. He simply nodded, unable to find the words, and moved away. His posture, a little less rigid than before. As she stood up, smoothing the green fabric of her dress, her gaze drifted across the room. She wasn't looking for power or status. She was observing the small human dramas playing out in the corners. She saw the tired look on the face of the violinist, the forced smile of a woman trying to impress her companions, the way a man in a tight collar kept loosening it when he thought no one was watching. She saw the art on the walls not as assets, but as memories, the painting from their trip to Florence, the sculpture they had bought because it made them both laugh. This was her home, filled with her life, and tonight it was filled with strangers. She felt a sense of detachment, a quiet peace in being an unseen observer in her own world. It was from this position, near the edge of the party, that she caught the attention of a small, tight-knit group of women. They were a perfect example of the party's elite. They were dressed in the latest, most aggressive fashions, their dresses in bold, tension-grabbing colors like crimson and electric blue. Their jewelry was loud, their laughter was a little too sharp, and their eyes were constantly scanning the room, assessing, judging, and ranking everyone they saw. At the center of this group was a woman who radiated a brittle sort of confidence. She was the undisputed leader, and the others followed her cues like ducklings. Her eyes, sharp and critical, had been sweeping the periphery of the room, dismissing everyone who wasn't worth her time. And then they landed on the woman in the simple green dress. "Look at that," the leader said, her voice a low, conspiratorial purr that was still loud enough to carry. She gestured subtly with her champagne flute in the direction of the host's wife. It seems the invitation list was a bit inclusive this year. One of her companions, a woman with a diamond necklace so tight it looked like it was choking her, followed her gaze. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. Darling, she must be someone's assistant. Trying to blend in? That dress is almost tasteful in a completely forgettable way. It's the hair. Another one chimed in, touching her own perfectly coiffed, elaborate hairstyle. So casual. It's as if she doesn't even realize where she is. The leader of the group took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving the quiet woman by the glass doors. She had seen her interact with the waiter. The act of kindness had been registered, but it had been filtered through her own cynical worldview and interpreted not as compassion, but as a sign of low status. "It's one thing to be discreet," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's another to be invisible. Some people simply don't belong in certain rooms. It's a matter of knowing your place," her friends murmured in agreement, their gazes now fixed on the woman they had so easily and so wrongly categorized. They saw her simple elegance as a lack of style, her quiet demeanor as a lack of personality, and her act of kindness as a menial task. They were the gatekeepers of this world, and in their minds, she had failed to meet the minimum requirements for entry. The woman in the green dress, oblivious to their scrutiny, turned her gaze towards the front of the room. Her eyes found her husband's. For a brief moment, across the sea of people, their looks connected. He was still smiling for the senator's wife, but his smile softened, became genuine. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a shared moment of understanding in the middle of the chaos, a silent conversation that said, "Asterisk, I see you. I wish I were over there with you." Asterisk, she smiled back, a small, private curve of her lips that was meant only for him. But the socialite and her friends didn't see the connection. They didn't see the love. They only saw a woman staring at the host of the party, another piece of evidence to support their flimsy theory. "How pathetic," the leader whispered to her circle, a final, damning judgment, gazing at him like a lovesick puppy. "It's truly a shame Julian's staff can't be as polished as his guests." She turned away, dismissing the quiet woman completely, her interest already waning and moving on to her next target for scrutiny. The conversation moved on, but the cold, dismissive words hung in the air, an unseen poison in the opulent room. The quartet continued its gentle serenade, a soundtrack to a world of carefully constructed perfection. The woman in the simple green dress, having ensured the young waiter was all right, found herself drifting away from the main thoroughfare of traffic. The crowds near the bar and the entrance were too thick, the energy too frantic. She sought a quieter pocket of the party, place where she could just breathe and be for a moment. Her eyes landed on a large landscape painting hanging in a secluded alcove, a spot slightly removed from the grand ballroom's main floor. It was a piece she knew intimately. It depicted a rolling Tuscan hillside at dusk, the sky a swirl of fiery orange and soft purple, cypress trees standing like dark sentinels. She and her husband had found it in a tiny gallery in a small, sun-drenched village. Years before, he had become a name on everyone's lips. They had been young, just starting out, and they had spent their entire travel budget on it. They had eaten bread and cheese for the rest of their trip. But every time they looked at a photo of the painting, they remembered the feeling of that sun on their faces and the promise of a future they would build together. It wasn't the most expensive painting in the house, not by a long shot, but it was the one that held the most warmth. She stood before it now, a small private smile on her lips. The noise of the party faded into a dull hum, replaced in her mind by the memory of cicadas and the taste of cheap red wine. She was so lost in the memory that she didn't notice the approach of the small group of women. Their sharp laughter cutting through the quiet hum of the room, like glass. It was the same clique from before, led by the woman with the brittle confidence. They had grown tired of holding court in the center of the room and were making a slow, predatory circuit of the perimeter, their eyes scanning for new forms of amusement. They spotted the woman in green, standing alone and seemingly mesmerized by the painting. It was too perfect an opportunity to pass up. "Well," the leader's voice announced, not loud enough to carry across the room, but more than loud enough for the woman in green to hear. Finding a moment of peace? How quaint! They formed a semicircle around her, a subtle but effective act of intimidation. They were close enough that she could smell the mix of expensive, competing perfumes, a cloying scent that made her feel slightly dizzy. The woman in green turned from the painting, her calm expression unchanged. She gave them a polite, neutral nod, acknowledging their presence but inviting no further interaction. This lack of a desperate need for their approval only seemed to fuel their disdain. The friend with the choking diamond necklace stepped forward, peering at the painting with a critical eye. "It's a bit dramatic, isn't it?" she said, her voice laced with faux connoisseurship. "All that orange. So much emotion. My personal taste runs to cooler, more restrained pieces." "It's certainly a statement," the leader agreed, her eyes not on the art, but on the woman in green. "One has to wonder if some of these newer, more modern collectors truly understand what they're buying. It's not enough to just have a famous name on the wall. It's about pedigree, about history, about knowing why a piece is valuable." Her words were a double-edged sword, a commentary on the art and a direct personal attack on the woman standing before it. They were assuming she was just another person dazzled by a pretty picture, someone who couldn't possibly grasp the nuances of the art world they inhabited. The woman in green remained silent. She had learned long ago that arguing with people like this was a pointless exercise. They didn't want a discussion. They wanted a surrender. They wanted her to feel small, and she refused to give them the satisfaction. Her silence, however, was interpreted as a lack of understanding, a confirmation of their prejudices. "Oh, I agree completely," a third woman chimed in, eager to please the leader. "It's the same with fashion. You can spot someone who is new to money from a mile away. They either try too hard, wearing every label at once, or they go in the opposite direction, wearing something simple," she said, letting her eyes sweep slowly and deliberately over the woman's green dress. "In a misguided attempt to appear chic. It's a fine line, and most people fall right off it." The leader smiled, a thin, cruel curve of her lips. "It's a matter of breeding, isn't it? You either have it, or you don't. It can't be bought." She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible. "It's about knowing your environment, adapting. For example," she continued, gaze dropping to the woman's simple, unadorned hands, "one must be careful when touching things. The oils from your skin can be so damaging to the delicate surfaces." She gestured vaguely towards the ornate, gilded frame of the painting, a clear implication that the woman was a clumsy, uncultured threat to the precious objects around her. This was the moment a flicker of something hurt. Annoyance, A flash of anger crossed the woman's face. It was there for only a second before being expertly suppressed. But it was enough. The socialites saw it, and they savored it. It was the reaction they had been fishing for. They had gotten under her skin. She decided she had had enough. This was no longer a place of peace. It had been violated. She turned away from them, her back now facing their cruel smiles. She focused her attention back on the Tuscan hillside, on the memory of warmth and love. She mentally transported herself back to that small village, to a time before rooms like this, and people like them, had become a regular part of her life. She built a wall around herself, brick by mental brick. And their words became just indistinct noise on the other side, but they weren't finished. Emboldened by her retreat, they pressed their advantage. "It's no use trying to ignore us, darling," the leader's voice said, now sharp and cold, all pretense of politeness gone. "We're just trying to offer some friendly advice. Parties like this, they have a certain ecosystem, and every creature needs to know its place." The woman in green didn't move. She didn't turn around. She just kept her eyes on the painting, on the memory of a happier, simpler time. "Look at her," the leader said to her friends, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. "Completely out of her depth. She probably thought she could blend in, maybe catch the eye of someone important. It's a sad little game some people play. But you can't fake class. You can't fake connections. You can't just walk into a world like this and expect to belong." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then she delivered the final, cruelest blow. "Some people are just guests," she said, her voice laced with venom. "And some people are just the help. It's a terrible thing to get them confused." The words hit their target with the intended force. They were designed to humiliate, to reduce the woman to nothing more than a servant, a piece of furniture. It was the ultimate expression of their snobbery, a complete and total annihilation of her worth as a human being in their eyes. What they didn't see, what no one in the alcove could see, was the scene unfolding on the second-floor landing that overlooked the ballroom. The host had finally extricated himself from the senator's wife. He had made his excuses, citing a need to check on the catering staff, but his true mission was to find his wife. His eyes scanned the ground floor, a quick, practiced sweep. He saw the crowds, the lights, the sea of faces, but not the one he was looking for. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. Then he saw her. She was in the alcove with the painting, the one from Tuscany. A wave of relief washed over him. He started to move towards the grand staircase to join her, but then he stopped. He saw the other women approaching her. He recognized the leader of the group, the wife of a tech CEO he had had dealings with in the past. He knew her reputation. He knew the kind of poison she was capable of spewing. He remained where he was, hidden by the ornate balustrade of the landing, his body tensing. He watched them form their circle. He couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he could see the body language. The predatory postures, the mocking glances, the way they crowded her space. He saw his wife stand her ground, her back straight, a statue of quiet dignity. He saw her turn away from them, a clear signal of dismissal, and he saw them lean in, their leader's mouth moving, her expression one of pure, unadulterated cruelty. He saw the subtle stiffening of his wife's shoulders, the only sign that their words were landing. He saw her turn her back completely, a fortress of solitude against their attack. And he saw the leader deliver her final parting shot, a smug, triumphant look on her face as she and her clique turned and walked away. Laughing amongst themselves, the hosts stood frozen on the landing. The warm, charming facade of the perfect host fell away, replaced by something cold and hard as ice. The easy smile was gone, his lips now a thin, straight line. His eyes, usually filled with warmth and laughter, were now dark with a fury so intense it felt like a physical force. The party noise, the music, the chatter, it all faded away. All he could see was the image of his wife standing alone, being torn down by a pack of hyenas. All he could feel was a cold, protective rage that settled deep in his bones. He watched as his wife remained with her back to the room for a long moment, her head bowed slightly. He wanted to go to her, to wrap his arms around her and shield her from the world. But he knew that wasn't what she needed right now. And he knew that this wasn't over. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a quiet word of comfort. This was a public insult. It required a public correction. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing the rage down, channeling it into a cold, calculated calm. He straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his jacket, and his face became a mask of unreadable neutrality. He turned his gaze from his wife and fixed it on the retreating forms of the women, who had dared to touch what was most precious to him. The plan for the rest of the evening had just changed. The party was about to take a very different turn. Asterisk, the cold fury on the second-floor landing was a living thing. It coiled in the host's stomach, a tight, icy knot that pushed out every other feeling. He watched the group of women walk away, their heads thrown back in shared triumphant laughter. They thought they had won a small, meaningless battle. They had no idea they had just started a war. He then turned his gaze back to his wife, who was still standing before the Tuscan painting, a solitary figure in a sea of opulence. He saw her shoulders rise and fall in a slow, deep breath. She was collecting herself, piecing back together the quiet composure they had tried to shatter. He knew her. She wouldn't let this break her. She was stronger than any of them could ever imagine. But that didn't erase the fact that they had tried. It didn't erase the venom they had spit into the air of his home. He remained there for a full minute, forcing the rage to cool from a white-hot fire into a blade of ice. He needed a clear head for this. It couldn't be a messy, emotional outburst. It had to be a surgical strike, precise and devastating. He ran a hand over his face, the mask of the charming host settling back into place, but his eyes held a new dangerous light. He had a plan. The final speech of the evening, the one everyone was waiting for, so they could politely make their exit, would no longer be a simple thank you. It would be a reckoning. He began to move. Not with the angry energy of a man seeking revenge, but with the unhurried, deliberate grace of a predator. He descended the grand staircase, his steps silent on the plush carpet. As he moved through the crowd, he paused here and there, clapping a man on the back, sharing a quiet word with an elderly patron, his smile perfectly in place. No one looking at him would have guessed the storm brewing just beneath the surface. He was the master of the room, and he was about to remind everyone of what that meant. He saw his wife leave the alcove and move towards a less crowded corner of the room, seeking refuge near a tall potted fern. Their eyes met across the space. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. She couldn't have known what he was planning, but she knew him. She saw the resolve in his eyes, and a flicker of trust answered in her own. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible smile, sign that she was okay, finally. He made his way to the small stage at the front of the ballroom where the string quartet was playing. He gently tapped the leader of the quartet on the shoulder and whispered something in his ear. The musician nodded, and the music softened, and then faded out completely. A hush began to fall over the room, a slow, rolling wave of silence as people turned their attention to the stage. The host stepped up to the microphone, the soft lights of the chandelier catching the silver in his hair. He looked out over the sea of expectant faces, his expression calm and thoughtful. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice warm and clear, amplified through the speakers. "I want to thank you all, from the bottom of my heart, for being here tonight. Your generosity and support for the Hawthorne Foundation are truly overwhelming. Because of you, we can continue the work that is so vital to so many." A polite smattering of applause rippled through the room. He waited for it to die down, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He saw the socialite and her clique near the front, their faces expectant, already looking a little bored, as if they were just waiting for him to finish so they could leave. "It's interesting," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more philosophical. "We live in a world that is obsessed with measurement. We measure success in numbers, in bank accounts, in stock prices. We measure people by the labels on their clothes, the cars they drive, the size of their homes. It's an easy way to keep score, isn't it? It's simple. It's clean." He paused, letting the idea hang in the air. "But I've found that the most important things in life, the things that truly matter, are impossible to measure. You can't put a price on integrity. You can't quantify kindness. You can't chart the value of a loyal friend on a spreadsheet. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time, people began to sense that this was not going to be a typical speech. The atmosphere in the room began to change, a current of anticipation running through the crowd. We often talk about building things, he went on, his voice losing some of its warmth and taking on a harder, more resonant edge. We build companies, we build fortunes, we build names for ourselves. But a building is only as strong as its foundation. You can cover a facade with the most expensive marble and gold. But if the foundation is rotten, the whole thing is destined to crumble. It's the part you don't see that holds up the entire structure. His gaze slowly, deliberately, came to rest on the socialite and her group. They began to shift uncomfortably under his stare. The leader of the clique forced a tight smile, but her eyes were narrowed with confusion and a dawning sense of alarm. Some people, the host said, his voice now dropping to a lower, more intense level that commanded absolute attention, don't understand that. They are so focused on the facade, on the shine, on the surface level impression, that they forget to look for the substance. They walk into a beautiful room, and instead of appreciating the craftsmanship, the history, the soul of the place, they only see what they can possess, or what they can criticize. They see a person, and instead of trying to understand their heart, their mind, their story, they only see a reflection of their own shallow values. The room was utterly silent now. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. The socialite's face had gone pale. She was starting to understand. Her companions looked at each other, their eyes wide with panic. It's a sad way to move through the world, he continued, his voice like ice. It's a lonely, empty existence. Because when you judge everything by its cover, you never get to read the incredible stories inside. And worse, you leave a trail of poison behind you, trying to make others feel as small as you secretly feel inside. He let the silence stretch for a long, painful moment. The socialite looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her power in the room was evaporating with every word he spoke. He had stripped her bare in front of everyone, not with insults, but with the simple, undeniable truth. Then, suddenly as the storm had gathered, his expression softened. The hard edge in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of profound warmth and love. He turned away from the frozen socialites and looked towards the corner of the room where his wife was standing. "But I am lucky," he said, his voice filled with a new emotion, a deep and resonant sincerity that captivated everyone. "I learned a long time ago what true value is. I learned that my own success, this company, this foundation, this house, it's all just a facade. It's meaningless without the person who is my foundation, my partner, my compass." He extended a hand towards her, a gesture of invitation that was both powerful and gentle. "She is the brilliant mind behind the Hawthorne Foundation, the one who reads every proposal, who meets with every family, who works tirelessly not for recognition, but because it is the right thing to do. She is the architect of the good we do." Collective gasp went through the crowd. All heads turned to look at the woman in the simple green dress. She began to walk towards the stage, her steps slow and graceful. She wasn't hesitant. She wasn't blushing. She held her head high, a quiet dignity in her posture that was more powerful than any of the loud, arrogant displays in the room. She was not being rescued. She was being honored as she reached the stage. He helped her up the steps and placed a protective arm around her waist. He turned back to the microphone, his voice filled with an immense, unshakable pride. "Everyone," he announced, his words the final, crushing blow. "I would like you to properly meet my wife, Dr. Thorne." The name hung in the air, a title that recontextualized everything. Dr. Thorne? Not a quiet woman. Not a member of the staff, not an unfortunate guest. A doctor, the brilliant mind behind the entire enterprise. The room erupted in a wave of stunned whispers, and then a thunderous applause that was far more enthusiastic and genuine than the polite clapping from before. The socialite stood frozen, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her carefully constructed world had just been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking like a fish out of water. She tried to catch the host's eye, to offer some stammering, pathetic apology. But he simply looked at her with a cold, dismissive finality and gave a single, slow shake of his head. The message was clear: you don't exist to me anymore. He then turned his full attention to his wife, ignoring the rest of the room. The applause faded into a background hum as he looked down at her, his expression softening into one of pure love. She, in turn, looked up at him, her eyes shining. She didn't look at the socialite or her clique. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, the embodiment of the grace and class they had so cruelly accused her of lacking. The victory was not in their humiliation, but in this quiet, unbreakable moment of shared respect and love. The party had been transformed, and the true power in the room had been revealed, not in a loud display of wealth, but in a quiet defense of honor. Asterisk, the applause was not just polite. It was a wave of genuine emotion, a roar of approval that washed over the ballroom and seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was a sound of vindication, a collective cheer for the quiet dignity that had been so viciously attacked. On the stage, the host held his wife close, his arm firm, protective band around her. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking down at her, his expression a mixture of fierce pride and profound relief. She, in turn, looked up at him, her eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the crystal chandelier above. It was the light of trust, of a bond that had been tested in the fire and proven to be unbreakable, but not everyone was applauding. In the front of the room, the small clique of socialites stood frozen, islands of silence in a sea of noise. The leader's face was a ghastly shade of white, the carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock and humiliation that had drained the color from her skin. Her mouth was slightly agape, as if she was still trying to process the words that had just destroyed her social standing. Her companions looked similarly stricken, their eyes wide with panic. They were no longer predators. They were prey, exposed and cornered. The leader, in a desperate act of self-preservation, tried to catch the host's eye. She attempted a smile, a pathetic, trembling gesture that was meant to be an apology. She opened her mouth to speak, to stammer out some excuse, some plea for forgiveness. But the host's gaze, when it finally swept over her, was colder and more empty than any winter sky. There was no anger in it, no heat. There was nothing at all. He looked right through her as if she were a pane of glass. He gave a single, slow, deliberate shake of his head, a final, silent dismissal. It was more crushing than any shouted insult could have ever been. It told her that she was no longer worthy of his anger, or even his attention. She had been erased. The message was received. The leader grabbed the arm of the woman next to her. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. Now. They huddled together like a frightened flock of birds, their bravado and cruelty completely gone, replaced by a primal need to escape. But leaving was not as simple as walking out the door. As they turned to make their way to the exit, they found their path blocked by a wall of cold stares. The other guests, the very people they had looked down upon all night, now watched them with open contempt. No one stepped aside. No one offered a polite smile. A path did eventually open, but it was a narrow, reluctant one, and whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. "Did you hear what she said? Serves her right. Awful woman."
Ow.
To his wife. "I can't believe it." They kept their eyes fixed forward, their cheeks burning with shame. They could feel the weight of hundreds of judgments pressing down on them. The grand ballroom, which had felt like their kingdom just an hour ago, became a courtroom where they had been found irrevocably guilty. They didn't bother to say their goodbyes to the host or his wife. They just fled, pushing past the massive front doors and out into the cool night air, leaving the warmth and laughter behind them. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting them off from the world they had so desperately wanted to be a part of, and had now lost for good. Inside, the atmosphere of the party began to transform. It was as if a poison had been drawn out of the room. The tension that had hummed beneath the surface, the subtle competition and posturing, had all vanished. In its place was a more relaxed, genuine energy. People started to smile more freely, their conversations becoming less about status and more about substance. The host and his wife finally came down from the stage. Immediately, they were surrounded, but this time, it was different. People approached them with a newfound respect. An elderly man, a renowned art historian, came up to the wife and took her hand. "My dear," he said, his voice warm and sincere, "your taste is impeccable. That Tuscan landscape is one of the finest pieces in this entire collection. It has a soul." He wasn't just flattering the host's wife. He was speaking to her as an equal, someone who understood. A woman who ran a major nonprofit came next. Ignoring the host for a moment to speak directly to his wife, "Dr. Thorne," she said, using the title with genuine respect, "I've been following the work of your foundation for years. The youth literacy program is revolutionary. I would love to talk to you sometime about how we might collaborate." The wife smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes, and engaged in a thoughtful conversation about a topic she was clearly passionate about. She was no longer an accessory on the arm of a powerful man. She was a power in her own right. Everyone in the room now knew it. The host watched from a short distance, a quiet satisfaction settling in his heart. This was what he had wanted. Not just to punish the cruel, but to elevate the worthy. He saw his wife come alive in these conversations, her intelligence and compassion shining through. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman the world was finally getting to see. After about 20 minutes of graciously accepting congratulations and well wishes, he gently touched his wife's arm. "Can I steal you away for a moment?" he asked softly. She nodded, excusing herself from the conversation. Together, they slipped away from the crowd. Moving down a quiet hallway and into the sanctuary of his study, the door clicked shut behind them, and the noise of the party faded to a distant murmur. The room was a masculine space filled with dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint, comforting smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. It was a room that felt lived in and real, stark contrast to the pristine perfection of the ballroom. He let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding all night. He turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry you had to endure that." She reached up and placed a hand on his cheek, her touch soft and reassuring. "I'm all right," she said, and he could see that she meant it. It was unpleasant, of course, but it was also just noise. She looked into his eyes, her gaze clear and steady. They saw a dress and a price tag. They saw a quiet woman and assumed there was nothing going on inside. "You saw me? You have always seen me. That's all that has ever mattered." Covered her hand with his own, his heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. "I always will," he promised. "I should have stepped in sooner." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You handled it perfectly. You didn't get down in the mud with them. You just turned on the lights, and they scattered. It was the most powerful thing you could have done." He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. For a long time, they just stood there, in the quiet of the study, finding comfort in each other's presence. The ordeal was over. The battle was won. Out in the ballroom, the party continued, but in here it was just the two of them, a connection stronger and more affirmed than ever before. The world could have its opinions and its judgments, but in this room, they had their own unshakable truth. The quiet of the study was a balm, a gentle reprieve from the noise and the drama of the evening. He held her, feeling the tension slowly drain from his own body, replaced by a profound sense of peace. He could feel the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against his chest, a rhythm that had been the constant soundtrack to his life. In a world of shifting alliances and fleeting loyalties, she was his anchor. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands gently cupping her face. His thumbs stroked her cheeks, wiping away a single tear he hadn't realized had fallen. "I am so sorry," he said again, his voice thick with an emotion that was far more powerful than the anger he had felt earlier. It was a deep, aching regret. "I should have been there. I should have stopped them before they even started." She shook her head, her own hands coming up to rest on his. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You can't protect me from the world, any more than I can protect you from it. People will always say things. Their words are their own burden to carry. You didn't fail me. You honored me." She looked into his eyes, and he saw no trace of the victim in her gaze, only a clear, unwavering strength. "You didn't get angry. You didn't create a scene. You just told the truth. You turned on the lights, and all the little cockroaches scattered. It was the most elegant, powerful thing I have ever seen." A small, tired smile touched his lips. "I just wanted them to see what I see," he whispered. "I wanted them to see you. They can't," she said simply. "And that's their loss." She leaned in and kissed him, a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of 1,000 shared moments, a history that no amount of money could buy and no amount of cruelty could tarnish. When they pulled apart, the atmosphere in the room had settled, the last remnants of the night's conflict dissolving into the quiet comfort of their shared space. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go back out there. Let's enjoy the rest of our party." When they re-entered the ballroom, it was like stepping into a different world. The undercurrent of tension and competition was gone. The air felt lighter, the laughter more genuine. As they moved through the room, people's reactions had changed completely. Before, they had offered polite nods to the host and dismissive glances to his quiet wife. Now, they looked at them both with a new, undisguised respect. A powerful media mogul, a man known for his gruff demeanor, stopped the host's wife to compliment her on a recent article she had published about educational reform. He didn't just give a cursory compliment. He engaged her in a detailed, intelligent conversation, his eyes alight with interest. He wasn't just being polite to the boss's wife. He was genuinely impressed by Dr. Thorne. They stayed for another hour, not as the king and queen of the ball, but as a couple enjoying the company of friends, old and new. They didn't hold court. They mingled. They listened more than they spoke. When they finally decided to leave, they didn't make a grand exit. They simply slipped out the side door, leaving the remaining guests to enjoy the music and the champagne. In the quiet of the back hallway, they saw the catering staff beginning the monumental task of cleaning up. The host stopped and spoke to the head chef, thanking him and his team personally for their incredible work. His wife spoke to the young waiter she had helped earlier, asking him if the rest of his night had gone smoothly. They didn't see staff. They saw people. It was a small gesture, but it was the truest reflection of who they were. The next morning, sun rose on a very different world for the woman who had led the clique of socialites. She woke up in her pristine, minimalist bedroom, the events of the previous night crashing down on her like a physical weight. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She reached for her phone, a familiar morning ritual, expecting to find a flurry of text messages from her circle, dissecting the evening's drama. But there was nothing. The screen was silent. She scrolled through her contacts, her fingers hovering over the names of the women who had been her acolytes just hours before. She couldn't bring herself to type a message. What would she say? Asterisk, sorry I got us publicly ostracized from the most powerful man in the city. Asterisk, her isolation was palpable. The silence of her phone was a louder condemnation than any shouted insult. She was alone in her cold, beautiful house. A queen without a kingdom. The real blow came later that morning when her husband called her into his home office. He was a man who prided himself on his own status, a CEO who had clawed his way to the top. He looked at her not with anger, but with a cold, weary disappointment. "That call I just had," he said, his voice flat. "It was from the Thorne Corporation." Her heart sank. "About what?" "The merger. The one we've been negotiating for 6 months. The one that was supposed to be finalized next week." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "They're reevaluating their strategic direction. They're pulling out." She stared at him, the blood draining from her face. "But why?" Everything was going so well. Her husband gave her a long, level look. They were very polite, very corporate, but the message was clear. They said they felt our company's corporate culture was not aligned with their core values. They mentioned a lack of fundamental respect at the highest levels. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "He didn't just ruin your party. He didn't just embarrass you in front of your friends. He quietly, calmly, and without a single raised voice, just cost our company a 9-figure deal. And he did it because of you." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just social embarrassment anymore. It wasn't just about being uninvited to the next gala. Her cruelty, her snobbery, her moment of thoughtless malice had had real-world, catastrophic consequences. She had always operated under the assumption that there were no consequences for people like her. She had just been proven spectacularly wrong. The true cost of her actions was not in lost invitations, but in lost fortunes. In the hard work of her husband and hundreds of their employees, undone by her petty, vicious words a week later. The host's wife was sitting in a small, brightly painted classroom in a community center that was one of the primary beneficiaries of the Hawthorne Foundation. She was not there to give a speech or to have her picture taken for a brochure. She was there to read a story to a group of 5-year-olds. She sat on a tiny, wobbly chair, a colorful book in her lap, surrounded by a sea of upturned, eager faces. After the story, a young woman who ran the center approached her. The woman was bright and passionate, but she had always been a little intimidated by the Foundation's powerful patrons. Today, however, she approached the host's wife with a new confidence. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with respect, "I was so inspired by what you did at the gala. Not just the speech, but the way you've always carried yourself. I was wondering if you might have some time to mentor me. I'm trying to develop a new outreach program, and I would be so grateful for your guidance." The wife smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "I would love that," she said. "Let's schedule a time next week." As she left the community center, the afternoon sun warming her face, she thought about the changes in her life. The world now saw her differently. They saw the doctor, the philanthropist, the brilliant mind. The invitations were still there, but they were different now. They weren't just for parties. They were for board meetings, for symposiums, for panels where her opinion was sought and valued. She didn't crave the attention, but she accepted it as a tool. It gave her a larger platform to do the work she truly cared about, to make a real difference in the world. She was still the same person who preferred a quiet night in to a crowded party, but she had learned to navigate the noisy world without losing herself. That evening, she found her husband in their library, a room filled with the things they both loved: books, art, and each other. He was standing by the window, looking out at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A mirror of the Tuscan landscape in the painting they both cherished. He turned as she entered, his expression softening. "I was just thinking about that night," he said, his voice quiet. I wish I could have shielded you from it." She walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. She could hear the steady, comforting beat of his heart. "You don't have to shield me," she said softly. "You just have to stand with me. And you always do." He held her close, the two of them silhouetted against the fading light. The drama of the gala felt like a lifetime ago, a distant storm that had passed. Leaving the air cleaner and clearer in its wake, they saw a dress and a price tag, she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. They saw a quiet woman and made up a story about her. But you saw me. That's all that has ever mattered. That's all that will ever matter. He didn't answer with words. He just tightened his embrace, a silent promise that would hold true for all the tomorrows to come. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the life they had built together, they had everything they needed. The world outside could have its noise and its glitter, its fleeting status and its hollow judgments. Here, in this space, they had a connection that was real, a love that was true, and a worth that could never be measured.